Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we look at the family collection of a fallen World War I soldier, a dockyard ledger from the Halifax harbour in 1802, and a pocket watch owned by a physician in the Spanish-American War. Gary looks at the personal memorabilia of a soldier killed in combat while serving in the Black Watch Battalion.
This is for the men in gate, and that's the men in gate there. And because his name is commemorated on that, it means he has no known grave.
Jennifer looks at a dockyard ledger compiled by retired naval captain John Inglefield.
It's very understated and unseemly. Like, you look at it, you think, oh, it's just a book. What's the point of preserving this? Why is it so interesting? But when you open the pages of that ledger, you really start to see the breadth of the history.
Kevin explores a Waltham pocket watch and the story of the National Guard physician who owned it.
People that get trauma when they're adults, they're already formed human beings. They have a mental image of who they are as an individual. The trauma takes that from you.
My name is Gary Smith, and I'm retired from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Today I brought in artifacts belonging to my great uncle, Stuart Smith, who served in the World War in 1914 to 1916. There are 3 different plaques, together with 2 photos in his personal wallet.
In 1909, the dominions of the British Empire would begin to standardise their militaries after the British Army. 5 years later, at the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the Dominion of Canada's permanent force was only 3,000 men strong. Recruitment began immediately. Between 1914 and 1918, 619,000 men and women enlisted for military service, with 424,000 ending up going overseas as part of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Each played a role in moving the Allies towards victory, with the land forces making major conflict-changing contributions at Vimy Ridge, the Second Battle of Ypres, the Somme, and Passchendaele. Canada emerged from the war as an internationally respected, proud, and capable nation. Driven by the courage of its citizens, this newfound standing helped to secure legislative independence when the Statute of Westminster was signed on December 11th, 1931.
So Gary, welcome to Militaria. Could you take a moment and tell us what you brought in today?
Today I've brought along the different artifacts that I've received through my family. I think it was around 2002, after I came back from a trip to Belgium. My uncle Edgar said, I think that you should now have possession of these memorabilia from your great uncle Stuart.
What you brought in, just to clarify, is this top one here is the memorial plaque. And this was issued by the Commonwealth to every soldier that was killed in action during the First World War. Underneath it is one of his identity discs. He would have had 2. And then this plaque here, which I think is quite interesting, says that his name is commemorated on the men in gate. And men in gate is for those that were killed in Belgium. Because his name is commemorated on that, it means he has no known grave. So they never found his remains. This, to me, is an important part of your history. So Gary, do you know anything of your great uncle's service?
Very little, only what I've researched as an adult.
He was an iron worker when he enlisted in the First World War. He enlisted with the 63rd Halifax Rifles on their recruiting draft of soldiers to be sent overseas as reinforcements. He got over to France in about 1916. He was sent to the 13th Canadian Infantry Battalion, which was the Black Watch, Royal Highlanders of Canada. If you were to get a list of battles that Canadians fought in, the Black Watch will probably check off the majority of them. Second World War, they were also involved in the raid in Dieppe and then clearing of Northwest Europe. So very important regiment in Canadian history, so much so that when the Canadian Army expanded after the Second World War, one of the battalions that came regular was the Black Watch. So he's with the 13th Battalion. He gets into the field, into the front line, May of 16, and unfortunately, a month later, he was killed in action. As I alluded to, with being on the men in gate, they did not find any of his remains. So he could have been in a trench collapse. He could have been hit by an artillery shell or all sorts of horrible things that you can only imagine that would cause you not to be identified. According to the 13th Battalion War Diary, they did a fairly major attack that day. There was a battalion attack, went over the top, and there's 2 pages of casualties in the War Diary. So it wasn't an isolated incident that he lost his life that day. It wasn't a wrong place at the wrong time. It sounds like a large attack that may not have gone well for the battalion that day. The thing that stuck out in my mind during the research was how detailed the Black Watch's War Diary was. Zooming in on the month that Private Smith was killed, they went to the trouble of listing every single soldier that was killed or injured. The family he came from, was it a large family? Do you have any memories?
I did receive some from my own grandfather,
Right.
with regards to Uncle Stuart's parents, but they did have large families on farms and things like that back in the day.
You had also mentioned that you remember visiting Granny Smith and seeing this prominently displayed in the home.
Yes.
I wonder if you can talk about that.
Certainly. It would be around 1960, so I would have been probably about 7 years old at the time. She was a very fragile person who sat with her cane on the back of her rocking chair. The house had a wood fire going. It was a small house and very warm. She lived with one of her daughters. But I remember a shelf and this particular article, the memorial plaque, being there with a poppy on it.
And is that what took your eye to it? Was seeing the poppy and thinking it meant something, or did someone actually explain what it was?
I believe at the time, because there was the picture of Uncle Stuart beside the scroll, I knew that even as a young child, that it was someone who died in the war. As I grew up through the years, the picture, the poppy, and the scroll were always together.
So obviously it had a lot of significance to the family.
Totally. The reason these artifacts are so important to me and to my family is to have had someone who did this supreme sacrifice of his life for our country.
So Gary, thank you so much for bringing these wonderful family artifacts into Militaria. I was wondering, what are the plans for them? Like, I realize you went to the trouble of framing that one, so these are obviously things that are important to you. Is there someone lined up to take charge of them when it's no longer your duty to look after them?
They would have gone to Brandon, our youngest son. I have a sad epithet to that. Brandon passed away in 2007.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Our oldest boy actually went on to study at Laval University and actually works at a museum.
Okay.
And Jarrett will eventually get these artifacts, and until such time they hang prominently in Brandon's bedroom in memory both to Great Uncle Stuart and to Brandon himself.
Once again, thank you so much for bringing these artifacts in.
Thank you, Gary. The knowledge of what that war was all about and how they had such very difficult times, so many things that they would have sacrificed. So remembering is very important, not just at Remembrance Day, but every day.
Coming up on Militaria.
I find this the most compelling piece that we have in the house because it's untapped and there is so much to learn from this. My name is Lisa McNiven and I've brought in an 1802 ledger from Commissioner Inglefield, who was running the dockyard. I picked this artifact because it's a really interesting piece of early Halifax history, a very special gem of time that's been lost through history.
10 years following the settlement of Halifax in 1749, North America's first naval dockyard was built on the harbour's western shores. Already operating as a seasonal base, the yard's official commission provided Britain's North American station permanent headquarters during the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, the French Revolutionary Wars, and the War of 1812. As the Royal Navy fortified across decades of conflict, the site quickly expanded to meet its needs. The British left in 1905, and in 1910 the dockyard was transferred to the Canadian government. The site was a major contributor to the Great War's Allied strategic defence until the collision of the SS Mont Blanc and SS Emo devastated the harbour. The Halifax Dockyard was designated a National Historic Site of Canada in 1923.
Hi, Lisa. Welcome to Militaria.
Thank you.
What do you have for us today?
I have a really interesting ledger from 1802 to about 1804. And I think it's a wonderful scope of the early history of Halifax and the Naval Dockyard in Halifax. And it was by a gentleman called John Inglefield. And John Inglefield was commissioner of the Halifax Dockyard. His ledger documents the day-to-day events that were happening in the Halifax Dockyard.
So from what I understand, Lisa, Inglefield, before he was a commissioner, he was a captain in the Royal Navy.
He was, and he joined the Royal Navy at a very young age of 11 in 1759. I guess you could say he was actually a naval career man. He had spent his entire life in the service. 1799, he was a captain, but he was put on the commissioner's list. In 1802, he arrives in Halifax, and he is the commissioner of His Majesty's Dockyard, Halifax Dockyard.
This one dockyard ledger has such an amazing breadth of history in regards to that legacy of people who served in the Navy and participate in the naval history that shapes our history today. Lisa, can you tell us a bit about Inglefield himself?
I do know that he had a family waiting for him in England. He had a son and a daughter, and this was his last commission before he retired. This was his last base.
And was that common that captains would retire and take up a commissioner's post either in Halifax, Bermuda, or anywhere else that the British were set up?
It was technically a vice admiral's commission. So a commissioner had a lot of scope, a lot of power, and it was given to captains that had retired, obviously, after years of service. Inglefield was a very precise individual. His notes are direct, and you would get a real sense of the day-to-day dealings he was also having to contend with in the dockyard. Everything from requisitioning to rope to human resource problems, who's getting fired. It's a real microcosm of Halifax and the administrative duties of a commissioner in a new naval dockyard. The requisition orders on Inglefield's ledger give an idea of what was a necessity to run a dockyard. They were looking for foodstuffs, they were looking for stationery supplies, they were looking for building supplies. It gives you a real idea of how many people these supplies were serving. It wasn't simply Navy, there was also a large civilian population working at the dockyard at the time.
So why would it be important for a museum to preserve the ledger?
There are so many interesting facts running through this. There's a reference to keeping the King's House at Tufts Cove. I haven't done any research on that. There are notes to the keepers at Dead Man's Island for requisitions for Napoleonic prisoner of war, requisitions for coal, for blankets, for keeping the prisoners warm. And it's also talking about the growth of Halifax and how the dockyard and the Navy are trying to keep up with this boom.
So as an archivist, this is a very valuable resource for anyone doing history in that early Halifax dockyard history and even the history of the Royal Navy being in North America and establishing their naval ports and their operations here.
Absolutely. It just needs a little more research, and I think it'll be certainly worth the effort.
There's always a possibility that there are other copies of the ledgers. I mean, this ledger would have been one of maybe like 100 plus ledgers. So if another ledger exists, we would definitely love to know about it. And what's also unique about this piece is the very dodgy history about how it survived through time.
Exactly.
Can you tell us a little bit about that history in regards to the ledger?
So the story that I've been given is that 1905, the British Navy leaves. They have a bonfire down at the dockyard, and if it's paper, it's being burnt. So there was a gentleman down at the dockyard. He's seeing this beautiful book in flames. Out of instinct, he kicks it out of the way, tucks it under his arm, and leaves through the gate and goes back into history for at least 100 years, where the book comes back to us through an ancestor of the gentleman that saved this beautiful document.
And what I find absolutely fascinating as well is that if you can see the darkening around the book itself, you can see that it was in the fire and that he actually pulled it from it and that it survived that. And the beautiful binding that exists on it now, it's not the original cover, but we had a conservator professionally conserve it so that we could keep this piece of history.
And it's so beautifully preserved, and it's legible because the conservator had told us that it had basically created a vacuum seal. So the fire singed the edges of the book, but it kept the contents pristine. And when you look at the lettering and the wording today, it was like he wrote it yesterday. It's just a perfect time capsule of naval history.
Between 1901 and 1905, the British Navy started to leave Halifax. So anything they didn't want to bring back to England with them, they either sold or disposed of. And so a lot of the ledgers and documents, they already had a copy of it in England. So why are we going to keep duplicates? So when this ledger was put into a fire, it wasn't a malicious intent. It was just, oh, okay, it's a copy, let's burn it, let's get everything cleaned up before we go. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for bringing this ledger from our collection. Currently, the ledger isn't on display at the museum. It's primarily used as a research resource. The reason why we don't put it on display is because even though it looks beautifully intact, like the day it was written, it is a fragile artifact. Artifacts such as this ledger are at risk of dehydration, over time becoming extremely brittle. So the more and more you handle it, the more at risk we put it. So unfortunately, we can't put it on display and actively talk about the ledger and let people see the ledger. We can at least use it as a historical reference to talk about the time period in which the ledger was created.
We want to keep it in pristine condition so that perhaps one day down the road we will have the resources to unlock some of its secrets.
So when you're preserving this in the archive, how would you wrap and pack this so that it was safe over time?
We have archive certified boxes, acid-free boxes. This gets wrapped in a piece of acid-free tissue, and the box is kept in controlled environment.
Lisa, thank you so much for bringing the ledger today. We have learned quite a bit from this ledger, and we can continue to learn from the ledger and that early history of the Halifax Dockyard. And I look forward to diving into the archives with you back at the museum and to explore more of this history.
Absolutely. I look forward to it. I think we're so lucky to have it in the house. It is one of our house gems, and I'm looking forward to more research and more information that it'll give up to us.
Coming up on Militaria.
I'm assuming after the war, he came back, and when he finished his medical degree, someone gave him the watch because it was a very expensive watch in its day. My name is Steve Jennings. I live here in Metro Halifax. In my spare time, I am a watch and clock repairer and collector. Today, I brought in one of my antique pocket watches. This particular one has a history behind it. You know who the owner was and the fact that he served in the military. I know enough about his story that I felt a bit of a connection, and I got his watch going.
During the late 19th century, American nationalism blossomed as the country prepared to participate on the international stage and flex its culture and power. At the same time, Spanish rule to the south was gaining attention for its harsh treatment of the Cuban people, who had long been fighting for independence. In January 1898, the USS Maine departed for Havana Harbor to safeguard American interests. 3 weeks later, it was destroyed and war was declared. 250,000 men and women enlisted, with many initial volunteers hailing from Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, and New York State. The Spanish-American War ended Spain's overseas empire, and the Treaty of Paris made it official on December 10, 1898. The victory helped kick off what is now known as the American Century.
Well, Steve, welcome to Militaria. You've brought in a watch from your collection. I was wondering if you could tell us what you've discovered about this. Well, it's a Waltham pocket watch, a Model 83, which they made a lot of them. It was made in 1900, and the owner's name is faintly printed on the dial in the middle. And this was kind of a popular thing at the time. People would get the dials personalized and mark them with important things in their life. So his university fraternity is in the top, and then the Spanish-American War flags are at the bottom because he served in the Spanish-American War.
Now you're saying he served in a National Guard unit, and when he was serving with them, you're saying he was a physician. Did he serve as a physician with the National Guard when he was in Cuba?
He was in the National Guard before the conflict started, and then was a surgical assistant during the war.
So the National Guard is in many ways the backbone of the American Army especially. So people join the National Guard to get that training, and they have a sense of sort of, citizen soldier responsibility. The motto of the National Guard is in peace and in war, we are the Guard. So again, as like a young man in New York State at the turn of the 19th century, it would be very much his sort of sense of duty to be part of the National Guard. So the National Guard is a long tradition of American citizens taking part in the sort of defense and the service of their country. So people have, for generations, have joined the National Guard with the best of intentions. But again, when they go to Cuba, there are upwards of over 2,000 casualties. So with that, this whole aspect of what he would have seen and whatnot. There's a lot of guerrilla warfare, the Cuban militia especially, and the Spanish troops. They make good use of the jungle and the terrain, and so there's a lot of like apprehension and tension. So many of them will incur the high casualty rate during and then after the war in terms of the effects of trauma have on soldiers.
I had no idea as to the scale of the conflict and the aftermath that this original owner of the artifact went through. I knew he was in the military and that he had served, but I didn't know a whole lot about the conflict. But whenever you get these watches like I do, occasionally, rarely, you get some sort of personal connection. And this watch came with a bunch of other watches that had no case, and I just bought it for parts. But when I saw the painted dial, it kind of interested me, and I thought, well, I wonder if I could find out who this guy was. Very helpful guy at the Virginia Military Institute who identified the logo as being a university fraternity logo, and then going through lists of folks who served in the Spanish-American War before we finally found him and tied it all together. His name was Stacy Williamson, and he was a young guy who joined the New York State National Guard while he was studying at Syracuse University, got called up as a surgeon's assistant. Well, you know, he was one of those forgotten people in time, right? He was a hero. This was his watch, and it meant a lot to him at one time. I felt like he had a story to tell, and it had never been told before. So I did feel a connection to him when I learned who he was and what he did.
Now, Steve, I was wondering if you could tell us about anything that you've discovered in the course of your research about what his life was like after the war when he came home and he finished his medical degree.
It was kind of a sad story. He was just a young man when he came home, finished his medical degree. His father was a physician, so he followed in his footsteps and opened a family practice in upper state New York and got married. They had a couple of kids. But you get a sense when you read what his life was like that he really didn't get much of a break from all that he saw and experienced during the war. He was made the town health officer and then was put in charge of the Marine Veterans Hospital. So he would have seen the aftermath of the war long after the war was finished.
Certainly, yeah.
He felt suicidal, depressed. He had issues, and he took his own life in 1908.
At the age of 32. Leaving a wife and 2 young children. Well, again, we know so much now about what war does to those that have to serve and go through those things. He never really got away from it because he's dealing with the aftermath in terms of the veterans. We know we call this PTSD today, but you know, it's trauma. In the time of the American Civil War and the aftermath of it, used to call it the soldier's heart. Romans and the Greeks refer to it as melancholia. This aspect of what war does to human beings, it's been around and it's been recorded and noticed for centuries.
It gave me an appreciation of the effects of PTSD and what it was like before it was recognized. A lot of people like this guy suffered.
Well, thanks so much for bringing this in and telling us the story of the original owner of this. It's a very tragic story for sure. You know, with your great research abilities, I bet you could track down his family.
We've started, we've tried.
You have? There you go. Okay.
Yeah. His children have both passed away, but you know, ideally this should be in their hands.
Yeah.
Or some sort of a museum for the New York State National Guard. This can live on because he was a hero.
You know, and again, if you're looking for another place potentially to reach out to in New York, the West Point Military Museum.
Okay.
He's a resident of New York and a citizen soldier of New York. So I wouldn't be surprised if they'd be interested.
Didn't know it existed. That's good to know.
Well, thanks again, Steve, for bringing this in and sharing the endeavor that you've done in not only restoring the watch, but in bringing back to life the memory of this healer and soldier.
Well, thank you. Without the story, it's just a watch, right? But when you know who the owner was and what their life was like and some of the special things that they might have done, it tells a story. You make a connection when there's a story attached to it.